So before I move on from this particular document, I just want to show you one more thing that will hopefully cement this concept of working with these digital watercolor virtual layers in your mind. I'm going to come up here and I'm going to choose erasers, and I'm going to choose the flat eraser. And now if I begin to erase, you can see I'm able to pull all that dry digital watercolor off the canvas along with the pencil, all as if it was one thing. However, this wet digital watercolor, if I go to erase this, you'll see I have no impact whatsoever. Now the reason why is because digital watercolor category has its own erasers. So you can see gentle, wet eraser, and I'll just go ahead and choose that. And now you can see I'm able to erase that digital watercolor like so. However, this gentle wet eraser will have no impact whatsoever on any kind of dried digital watercolor. So again, the thing to remember about digital watercolor is wet, you can work with it with all the digital watercolor tools, and dry, you can work with any of the regular media tools, meaning erasers, blenders, pencils, you name it. Basically the entire library of Coreal Painter tools except for the digital watercolor tools. Now again, the important thing to understand about this is that there is no new layer. This virtual layer is virtual, meaning that you may not always be able to tell whether you're working with wet digital watercolor or dry digital watercolor. So it's important that you keep these things straight in your mind. And this is one of the weaknesses of working with digital watercolor. This next category that I want to look at, and I'll just go ahead and close this document and go to File, New. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a few times by hitting Control+. So now we're at 100%, and I'm going to come down here all the way to the bottom and choose the watercolor category. Now in here, you'll see that we have, again, a bunch of different watercolor brushes. And if I choose something like, say, the Diffuse Camel, and I begin to paint with the Diffuse Camel, you'll see I'm laying down paint. As soon as I lift, it's going to diffuse. And this is not all that different from the digital watercolor, and except for the fact that maybe the diffusion is a little bit more realistic or a little bit more interesting looking, and that it's animated over a longer period of time. The other thing that's interesting about this is that a new layer has been created, and it's labeled watercolor layer, and it's also been assigned the gel composite method. Now gel is the second one from the top here. It's default and then gel. Gel is basically one of Painter's custom, one of the more useful, as for that matter, layer composite methods that Painter has available to it. Now, you could use different composite methods for these. They're not required. I mean, if you wanted to switch to something like, say, default, it's not going to create any problems. However, if we have something underneath this, and I'll just come back down to the pencil because that's a really good tool to showcase some of these effects. And we use the Real 2B pencil, and I begin to make a mark here. The first thing you'll notice is that only watercolor brushes can be used on watercolor layers. And that's because we're on a watercolor layer, and it's a special layer, which you can tell by the icon over here in the corner that's telling us that it's a watercolor layer. If I come back down to the canvas, remember I've switched this from gel to default, and I make the mark. What you'll see is that there's a white halo around that digital watercolor. And this is the reason why we're using the gel method, is because the gel method effectively allows that watercolor to behave more like real watercolors in the sense that it darkens and covers up whatever is underneath without that white halo. And again, like I say, if we were to use something like normal instead, we end up with that white halo again. If we use something like multiply, we might get a similar effect to gel. Multiply and gel are basically more or less interchangeable with slight variations. Generally speaking, though, anything in Coreal Painter, we tend to work with gel just because gel is a default composite method for Coreal Painter. Come back down to our watercolor category. We'll go ahead and look at some of these other. We've got the Diffuse Camel. Let's try the Dry Bristle. And here you can see there's really no diffusion at all. If we come down and we choose something like the Fine Bristle, not really much diffusion at all. If we come down over here and choose something like the Grainy Wash Bristle, now we're going to get a lot of diffusion, and we're also going to get a lot of grain. If we come over here and we choose something like the Runny Wash Bristle, we're going to get the diffusion, but we're also going to get a runny effect where it's actually running down the paper. If we choose something like the Runny Wet Bristle, you're going to see that we end up with an even more wet and runny effect. So the idea being here is that the name of the brushes is going to tell you an awful lot about how the brush is going to affect the canvas and what it's going to do. Now, very much like the digital watercolors, this watercolor layer, which we can actually see and work with here, and we can turn the visibility on and off, is going to be affected by whichever brush we have when we come up to layers and we say wet entire watercolor layer. So if we choose something like the dry bristle, which is one of the early ones here, remember it doesn't have any diffusion, it's pretty dry. And then we come up here to layers and we say wet entire watercolor layer. You'll see we don't really get any kind of effect. However, if we come back down to something like, say, our grainy wash bristle, and we come over here and we go to layers, wet entire watercolor layer, you'll see now that all the watercolor that was on that layer is diffused by the grainy wash bristle's properties. And if we come back down to say something like runny wash bristle, and we go to layers, wet entire watercolor layer, you'll see that we get everything that runs down the paper. So very much like the digital watercolor, the same principles in effect here, that this watercolor layer is going to be affected by whatever brush we have in this watercolor category when we choose the wet entire watercolor layer command here. Now what's different about this is that the dry watercolor layer does not work like the dry digital watercolor. The dry digital watercolor basically flattens those pixels down to the canvas and allows us to work with the dry tools over the top of it. The dry watercolor layer does not. If we click dry watercolor layer, nothing really changes. This is still a watercolor layer. If we come back over and we choose something like our pencil tool and we try to work on this layer, we'll still get that same alert. Only watercolor brushes can be used on watercolor layers. And as a matter of fact, nothing's really changed about this layer. The only thing that's going on with this layer is that it has been dried. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we come back over here and we choose watercolor, and we get that runny wash bristle again, and we go to our layers, wet entire watercolor layer, everything is still wettable. So what gives? What's with the whole dry watercolor layer? Well, while it's animating, if we come back over here and we say dry watercolor layer, the diffusion stops. So the idea basically being that this command for dry watercolor layer is effectively a means to stop that diffusion process. If it's going on for too long or you got the effect that you're looking for and you don't want it to diffuse anymore. Now this final command here, lift canvas to watercolor layer, this will basically allow you to take anything that's on the canvas and lift it to a watercolor layer. So right now we have some pencil marks, and if I were to come up here and grab some pastels and maybe just work on this canvas a bit, throwing down some pastel of various different look like that, and then come up here to our layers and lift canvas to watercolor layer. It's going to take all of what was on that canvas, and if we turn off the visibility, you can see the canvas is now blank. But now this is all on a watercolor layer. And if we come back over to our watercolor brushes, and we choose again something like the runny wash bristle, and we go to layers, wet entire watercolor layer, you can see that we're able to wet even pastels and pencils. So if we go to layers, dry watercolor layer, that stops that animation, and we are effectively left with what it was that we wanted as far as the point in the process that we want to stop this. Now that's an important thing to understand, and the reason why is because this is the only way that we can really control this is by using these commands for wet and dry watercolor layer. But the nice thing about that is if we use the layers lift canvas to watercolor layer, we can paint in any medium we want to and then lift it and then wet it all at once to create these types of diffusion effects if that's what we desire.